The air in the city of Oak Haven during the third week of December did not carry the scent of pine needles or roasting chestnuts. Instead, it smelled of exhaust fumes and the bitter metallic tang of an approaching snowstorm. For most people, this was the season of giving, a time of warmth and shared laughter under the glow of fairy lights. But for me, standing on the cracked pavement outside the gleaming glass fortress of Miller's Elite Motors, it was the season of a very specific kind of clarity. I adjusted the collar of my worn, grease-stained denim jacket, the fabric thin against the biting wind. To any passerby, I was just another struggling father, a man whose bank account was likely as empty as the discarded coffee cups rolling across the parking lot. I looked the part of a man who had spent his life under the hoods of cars, rather than in the boardrooms where their prices were decided. This was my camouflage, a deliberate choice made years ago when I stepped away from the family empire to build something of my own, away from the suffocating expectations of the sterling name. But today, the disguise felt heavy, weighted down by the small, crumpled piece of paper clutched in my calloused hand. It was a receipt for a toy, a vintage-style die-cast car, the only thing my 7-year-old son, Leo, had asked for this Christmas. I had walked into the dealership's boutique gift shop an hour ago, hoping for a simple transaction. Instead, I had been met with the predatory grin of Marcus Thorne, the dealership's top-performing sales manager. Marcus was a man who wore his arrogance like a tailored Italian suit, his hair slicked back with enough gel to withstand a hurricane. He didn't see a customer when I walked in. He saw a mark. He saw a man he could squeeze for a few extra dollars to pad his end-of-year commission. The toy, clearly marked on the shelf for $40, suddenly became $400 when I reached the counter. Marcus had leaned in, his voice a polished sneer, claiming it was a limited edition collector's item and that a man in my position should be grateful to even lay eyes on it. He laughed when I pointed out the price tag, a sharp barking sound that echoed through the marble-floored showroom. He told me that if I couldn't afford the toys, I certainly couldn't afford to be breathing the filtered air of his dealership. He had summoned 2 security guards to escort me out, tossing the toy at my chest and telling me to go find a bargain bin at a gas station. The humiliation had been public, witnessed by wealthy socialites sipping espresso in the lounge, their judgmental stares burning into my back as I was pushed toward the exit. Now, standing in the cold, I watched the festive lights of the dealership flicker. The Merry Christmas banner draped over the entrance felt like a mockery. Marcus Thorne didn't know that the struggling mechanic he had just insulted was actually Elias Sterling, the silent majority shareholder of the very investment firm that held Miller's Elite Motors debt. He didn't know that for me, $400 was less than a rounding error on a spreadsheet. But the amount wasn't the point. The point was the cruelty. The point was the way he used the holiday season as a weapon to make a man feel small in front of his peers. He thought he was the king of this glass castle, but he had forgotten that castles are built on foundations that can be dismantled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my lawyer, Sarah. I answered it without taking my eyes off the showroom window, where Marcus was currently shaking hands with a man in a tuxedo, likely closing another deal built on lies. Elias, Sarah's voice was crisp and professional. I've reviewed the portfolio for the Oak Haven acquisitions. Miller's Elite Motors is indeed on the list for the aggressive buyout phase. They've been struggling with liquidity issues for months, and the primary owner, Mr. Miller, is looking for an immediate exit before the new year to avoid the tax hit. Why the sudden interest in a mid-sized luxury dealership? I leaned against my rusted truck, the contrast between my vehicle and the Ferraris behind the glass being almost poetic. I told her about the toy. I told her about Marcus's laugh. I told her about the security guards and the way the socialites looked at my dirty fingernails. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah knew me. She knew that when I felt a sense of injustice, I didn't just get angry, I got even. She also knew that I had a particular distaste for people who used their positions of power to kick those they perceived as being below them. "So," she finally said, "you want me to move the closing date up?" I checked my watch. It was 4:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. "I want it closed by Thursday night," I replied, my voice as cold as the wind. "The dealership is hosting their annual Grand Christmas Gala on Friday evening. It's the biggest social event of the year for the local elite. I want the keys, the deed, and the employment contracts in my hand before the first bottle of champagne is popped. And Sarah? I want a full audit of Marcus Thorne's commission history. Every cent. I suspect our star salesman has been playing fast and loose with the books to maintain that lifestyle of his." I could hear the scratching of a pen on the other end. Sarah was already moving pieces on the chessboard. She told me it would be expensive to rush a closing of this magnitude, especially with the holiday shutdowns looming. I didn't care. Money was just a tool, and right now, I needed a very large sledgehammer. As I hung up, the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting silently through the air. I looked down at the die-cast car in my hand. It was a beautiful piece, a replica of a 1963 GT. Leo would love it, but the price I was about to pay for it was going to be the most expensive lesson Marcus Thorne ever learned. I climbed into my truck, the engine groaning as it turned over. I drove away, leaving the bright lights of the dealership behind me, but I wasn't retreating. I was just giving myself enough space to build up speed for the impact. For the next 48 hours, I would be a ghost. I would work from my private office in the city, far from the grease and oil of my shop, moving millions of dollars through digital veins to secure my prize. I would watch the weather reports, hoping for a blizzard that would trap everyone inside the dealership for the gala, making the walls of Marcus's kingdom feel even tighter when they finally started to close in. The plan was simple in its execution, but devastating in its intent. I wasn't just buying a business, I was buying the right to dictate the terms of Marcus Thorne's future. Every time he had looked down at a customer, every time he had inflated a price for a vulnerable family, every time he had used his charm to mask his venom, it was all coming to a head. The Christmas toy was just the catalyst. The overcharge was the spark. Now, I was going to bring the fire. As I reached my quiet home on the outskirts of town, I saw Leo waving from the window, his face lit by the glow of our modest Christmas tree. He didn't need the sterling millions to be happy, but he did deserve a father who could stand up to bullies. I walked inside, kissed his forehead, and tucked the toy away. "Just a few more days, Leo," I whispered. "Then we're going to have a Christmas no one in this town will ever forget." The transformation had begun. The mechanic was disappearing, and the owner was taking his place. By Friday, the hierarchy of Oakhaven would be flipped upside down, and the man who thought he could sell me a toy for 10 times its value would find out what it truly cost to mess with a sterling. The following 48 hours were a masterclass in silent warfare. While the rest of Oakhaven was busy wrapping presents and planning dinner menus, I sat in the high-rise sanctuary of my private office, a space Marcus Thorne could never dream of entering. The transition was seamless. Through a series of rapid-fire wire transfers and legal maneuvers, the parent company that owned Miller's Elite Motors was dismantled and reorganized under a shell corporation I controlled. Mr. Miller, desperate to settle his debts before the ball dropped on New Year's Eve, didn't ask questions. He was happy to take the inflated buyout price, unaware that his anonymous benefactor was the same man his manager had thrown out into the cold just days prior. Sarah worked tirelessly, her team of forensic accountants digging through the dealership's digital archives. By Wednesday night, the report she sent me was even more damning than I had anticipated. Marcus Thorne wasn't just arrogant, he was a thief. He had been skimming from the luxury tax incentives and overcharging walk-in customers like me for years, pocketing the difference in cash to fund his fleet of leased sports cars and his membership at the exclusive Oakhaven Country Club. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of snow, turning the city into a whitewashed, silent film. I spent the day at my small mechanic shop, working on a neighbor's brakes, letting the grease settle into the lines of my palms one last time. It was a grounding ritual. I needed to remember the weight of honest work before I stepped into the role of the executioner. Every time I looked at the clock, I imagined Marcus at the dealership, probably barking orders at the catering staff for the Friday gala, demanding the finest crystal and the most expensive vintage wines. He would be at the height of his perceived power, feeling untouchable as he prepared to rub shoulders with the city's elite. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already hollow. He didn't know that the very walls of the showroom now belonged to me, or that his employment contract, along with a thick folder of his fraudulent activities, was sitting on my desk in a leather binder. By Friday afternoon, the storm had intensified just as I had hoped. The winds howled across the Oak Haven Valley, trapping the who's who of the city inside the warm, opulent confines of Miller's Elite Motors. The grand Christmas gala was in full swing. I watched from a distance in my truck, seeing the shadows of people dancing behind the frosted glass. I saw the flash of cameras and the sparkle of diamonds. I took a deep breath and reached into the back seat, where a garment bag hung. I stripped off my work clothes and donned a tuxedo that cost more than Marcus's entire monthly commission. I scrubbed the grease from my hands until they were raw, then slid on a watch that was a family heirloom, a piece of the sterling legacy I rarely touched. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the tired mechanic was gone. In his place was a man with cold, predatory eyes and the bearing of someone who owned the air everyone else was breathing. I pulled my truck into the VIP valet lane. The young valet looked at my old vehicle with disdain, but when I stepped out in my tuxedo and handed him $100 bill, his jaw dropped. I didn't say a word. I walked toward the entrance, the heavy glass doors swinging open as if sensing the change in ownership. The heat of the room hit me, along with the scent of expensive perfume and pine. The room was packed. People were laughing, drinking, and admiring the rows of gleaming luxury vehicles that served as the backdrop for the party. And there, in the center of it all, stood Marcus Thorne. He was holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by a circle of admirers, telling a story with grand gestures. He looked like the king of the world. I waited at the edge of the crowd, watching him. I wanted to savor the moment. I wanted to see the exact second the light died in his eyes. It didn't take long. Marcus's gaze swept the room, looking for his next high-value target, when he locked eyes with me. For a moment, confusion clouded his face. He recognized the features, but the context was wrong. He remembered the man in the denim jacket, the man he had humiliated over a $40 toy. But the man standing before him now was wearing a tuxedo that fit better than his own, standing with a level of confidence that Marcus could only imitate. He excused himself from his circle and marched toward me, his face reddening with a mixture of confusion and lingering malice. He still thought he held the cards. He still thought this was his house. "You," he hissed, leaning in close so the guests wouldn't hear. "How did you get in here? This is a private event for clients, not for whatever it is you are. Did you steal that suit? I told you the other day you don't belong here. I'm calling security to have you arrested for trespassing. I'll make sure you spend Christmas in a cell for this stunt." He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling slightly. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a single folded document. It was the deed of sale and the corporate resolution naming me as the sole proprietor of the dealership. I held it out to him. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," I said, my voice low and resonant, cutting through the ambient noise of the party. "This is a private event, but it's my event. And as for trespassing, it's a bit hard to trespass on your own property, don't you think?" Marcus scoffed, snatched the paper, and began to read. I watched his eyes dart across the legal jargon, watched the way his hand began to shake as he reached the signature line. The color drained from his face, turning a sickly shade of gray that matched the winter sky outside. The sterling name at the bottom of the page hit him like a physical blow. He looked up at me, his mouth hanging open, the arrogance vanishing to reveal the coward underneath. This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mr. Miller wouldn't sell without telling me. I'm the top salesman. I'm the face of this place." I took a step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. Mr. Miller was happy to sell Marcus, especially when he realized his top salesman had been stealing from him for 3 years. "You see, when you overcharged me for that toy, you didn't just insult a customer, you invited a shark into your swimming pool, and I've been very, very busy looking at your books." The people nearby began to quiet down, sensing the tension. The music seemed to fade into the background as the power dynamic in the room shifted violently. The victim had returned, and he wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for a reckoning. The silence in the showroom was no longer the comfortable hush of luxury. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room as the socialites and city officials turned their heads toward us. Marcus tried to regain his footing, his eyes darting toward the security guards he had used to humiliate me days before. He let out a desperate, forced laugh, looking around at the crowd for support. "This is a prank, right? A Christmas joke? You expect these people to believe that a grease monkey from the edge of town just bought a multi-million-dollar dealership because of a toy car?" He raised his voice, trying to reclaim his stage. "This man is a fraud. Security! Remove him immediately!" The guards hesitated, looking between Marcus and me. They saw the tuxedo, they saw the sterling signet ring on my hand, and more importantly, they saw the absolute, terrifying stillness in my expression. At that moment, Sarah stepped through the front doors, followed by 2 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. She walked straight to me, handing me a leather-bound folder. "Everything is finalized, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice projecting to the farthest corners of the room. "The police are waiting in the manager's office to discuss the embezzlement evidence we uncovered this morning." The word embezzlement rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Marcus's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the polished marble floor, the champagne soaking into his expensive shoes. The very people who had been laughing at his jokes moments ago now took a collective step back, distancing themselves from the stench of his impending ruin. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "I don't just own the building, Marcus. I own your career. I have the records of every inflated invoice, every luxury tax you pocketed, and the specific footage of you altering the price of a child's toy to satisfy your ego." I turned to the crowd, raising my voice so every person who had looked down on me on Tuesday could hear me now. "This man represents everything wrong with Oak Haven. He thought that because I wore a denim jacket, I was invisible. He thought that because he had a title, he was a god. But tonight, the hierarchy changes. This isn't just a change in management, it's a cleaning of the house." I looked back at Marcus, whose knees were visibly knocking. "You are fired, Marcus. Not just from this dealership, but from this industry. I've already sent the evidence of your fraud to the licensing board and every other dealership owner in the state. By tomorrow morning, your name will be synonymous with thief. And as for the car you're driving, it's a company lease. The keys, please. Right now." The humiliation was total. In front of the mayor, the city's wealthiest investors, and the women he had been trying to impress, Marcus had to reach into his pocket and hand over his keys. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He looked exactly like the man he had tried to make me feel like when he threw that toy at my chest. As the police emerged from the back office to lead a sobbing, protesting Marcus away in handcuffs, the atmosphere of the gala transformed. The guests, ever the opportunists, began to swarm around me, offering congratulations, and trying to erase their previous judgments with forced smiles. I ignored them. I walked over to the boutique counter where the toy car still sat on a pedestal, now truly a collector's item, in a way Marcus never intended. I picked it up and looked at the price tag. I pulled out a $20 bill and a 10, placing them on the counter, the actual retail price. "The bar is closed," I announced to the room. "The party is over. But before you leave, know this. Miller's Elite Motors is being rebranded. Starting January 1st, this will be the Sterling Foundation's vocational center. We will be training young mechanics and providing fair-priced vehicles to families who actually need them. We're done selling status to people who use it as a mask for cruelty." The shock on their faces was the best Christmas gift I could have asked for. They had come for a party and stayed for a revolution. One by one, the elite shuffled out into the snow, their luxury cars idling in a line as they fled the scene of their social execution. I stood alone in the center of the vast, quiet showroom. The Christmas tree lights reflected in the windows, but the predatory energy of the place was gone. I felt the weight of the die-cast car in my pocket. It was finally mine, bought and paid for at a fair price, though it had cost Marcus Thorne everything he had ever valued. I walked to my old truck, the one the valet had looked at, with such disgust. I didn't need a Ferrari to feel powerful. I had my integrity, I had my son, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that for one night in Oak Haven, the world had been set right. I drove home through the deepening snow, the heater humming. When I walked through my front door, the house was warm and quiet. Leo was asleep on the sofa, a book about engines resting on his chest. I knelt beside him and placed the toy car under the tree, right at the front, where he would see it first thing in the morning. I didn't need to tell him about the dealership or the gala or the man in handcuffs. All he needed to know was that his father had kept his promise. As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of the holiday weekend, I sat by the fire and watched the embers glow. The revenge was complete. The power had shifted, and for the first time in years, the Sterling name stood for something I could finally be proud of. Merry Christmas, Oak Haven. The new owner is watching.